I'm trying to. She's on. We're live.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Jim Grant, the chair of the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, and though we couldn't meet in person, we thought we came up with an awesome plan this year. We have had a webinar series of book study on the book of Eddie Glaude, Begin Again, opening up to us the treasures of James Baldwin. Today we have a very excellent concluding episode in which we have three people that are going to discuss this book at depth. Our main presenter is Dr. Veena Howard, fresh from a phenomenal event that she hosted at Fresno State University, celebrating the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. She will be joined along with Darren Duerksen, a professor at Fresno State University, and Reverend Akiko Miyake-Stoner, who comes to us from the United Japanese Christian Church. We're so glad that they will be with us to break open this phenomenal book. To begin our program right now, I invite my good friend, Dr. Veena Kapoor, a very active member of Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual Organization, to introduce us and begin with a moment of silence and meditation.
Take a moment to remind myself I am a peaceful being. I am a loving being. Be clear in my thoughts that that's my true self. I am peace. I am love. Not just saying, but experiencing it within my own self. In silence, I can generate that energy to others and spread that in the world. Om Shanti. Okay, you can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kapoor, for reminding us of the importance of silence, reflection, meditation, as we begin this serious deep dive into very important, urgent, and perhaps difficult work today. We have a moderator today that we are very pleased to introduce at this point, Zena Chefi. She is currently completing her master's in public health at Fresno State University, and she's a community organizer with CARE. That would be the Council on American Islamic Relations, California, Sacramento Valley, Central California. Now, as an active person passionate about social justice and her own professional study at Fresno State in public health, she's committed that every person receive all those benefits and all those possibilities to enrich their life so that they can also serve others. Thank you, Zena, for your commitment to the underserved in everything you do and for being with us on Interfaith Scholar Weekend. Zena, please moderate our panel.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to introduce the representative for the Hindu faith tradition, Dr. Veena Howard. Dr. Veena Howard is a professor of Asian religions and coordinator for peace and conflict studies at Fresno State University. She has been involved with various interfaith activities for the last 2 decades. She served on the Board of Trustees of the World's Parliament of Religions, the oldest and largest interfaith organization. She is a scholar of Mahatma Gandhi and very interested in exploring his influence on the civil rights movement. She has also been researching the work of Reverend James M. Lawson Jr., legendary architect of the American civil rights movement. She's the author of several books. Welcome, Dr. Veena Howard.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm grateful to you, Zena, for your introduction, and Sister Veena for the meditation. And I want to extend my appreciation to Jim Grant and Melinda Murray Petrie for their hard work on this series. There is a lot of work went into it. And I would also like to welcome my co-panelists, Professor Darren Duerksen and Reverend Akiko Miyake-Stoner. And thank you, Staci. So I have attended the last 3 book review sessions and the interfaith engagement with Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our time. And so this book, as we have been discussing, reflects on James Baldwin's struggle with racism and dehumanization of African Americans, as well as his own tussle with what he calls Black freedom movement. According to scholar Tracy Smith, who wrote a review, Glaude also shared with his frustration through this book with the current state of the United States and the pain caused by violence and injustices against African Americans, end quote. So in these next 15 minutes, I'll provide a brief overview of the main lessons of the book and sketch my responses to the last 2 chapters as a scholar of Gandhi, Hinduism, and other religions of India. Then I'll grapple with the larger or the central question of the book with my colleagues. The question is how to begin again. Is it even possible to begin again? What lessons can we learn from James Baldwin's deep thinking? What can we learn from the US civil rights leaders who fought hard, sacrificed a lot to end segregation, to end Jim Crow laws? And they prepared the ground for us to begin again. Then I'll invite Dr. Darren Duerksen and Reverend Akiko Miyake-Stoner to share their reflections and insights for around 10 minutes each. And I hope we'll have some time to engage with the audience questions. And Zena has prepared some questions as well. So dear friends, students, colleagues, please write your questions as you hear us reflecting on these chapters. But I begin with the idea of elsewhere, which is a chapter in the book. According to Glaude, we are able to assess the situation more clearly from elsewhere, a place a bit removed from the site of the contention. In my personal life, I agree with Glaude's argument. It is my living in the United States, away from India, my elsewhere, I'm able to see both the issues of caste, untouchability in India, and the problem of racism in the US with more nuanced understanding. So on page 148, and I like to always count those pages as a scholar, Glaude notes the impact of violence against Black America on James Baldwin and on James Baldwin. Baldwin had become, in Baldwin's own words, a despairing witness. Baldwin writes in Great Spare, and I quote, America is changing all the time, but without changing at all. It's changing all the time, but without changing at all. I feel the same way, not just about America, but the world, not in physical terms, not in technological terms, but that in terms of interpersonal relationships, our shared experience, our care for each other. I hear pain and despair in Baldwin's voice. And I hear pain and despair in Cloud's voice. And I hear anger too, rightly so. Baldwin had witnessed the death and murder. He cries out, and I quote on page 155, Medgar, Martin, and Malcolm dead. These men were my friends, all younger than me, end quote. This is a powerful quote and will make anyone have tears in their eyes. Medgar was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm in 1965, and Martin in 1968. So imagine, 2 years apart, these young men are assassinated, all young men with lives filled with promise and progress. We can only imagine Baldwin's emotional state. But then he asks a very pointed question, and I quote, what does this say concerning the morality of this country or the morality of this age, end quote. How are we to understand the morality of this age, of this country, and in our current time? Cloud writes, I quote, Baldwin bears witness among the ruins, and in doing so, opening up the possibility that we might reach for another way of being in the world altogether. Another way. Mahatma Gandhi in India had asked the same question when hundreds of Indian citizens were shot by the British General Dyer and his troops on a very holy day, April 13, 1919, at a peaceful gathering, killing at least 379 people and injuring over 1,200 young men, women, and children. And you know what Rudyard Kipling writes after that? Dyer did his duty as he saw it. This great poet and writer. Was the duty of the colonial general to shoot innocent, peaceful people? Gandhi asked the same question when he saw the plight of the untouchables in his own Hinduism. The lives of millions of Hindus were considered not worthy of just being touched. They were considered unclean. Ironically, this is the group was keeping the other castes clean. King wrote in 1965, the only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy that recognizes the dignity and worth of all God's children. Nothing less than that. Gandhi called the Dalits, or the untouchables, children of God, Harijans. To shake the hearts of the upper caste Hindus who had forgotten their own philosophy of oneness and divinity of all beings, and the law of karma that we are supposed to treat each other with respect and love and humanity. Toward the end of his life, Gandhi cried out, and it's a very powerful quote, I better Hinduism dies than the untouchability live, end quote. He wanted his Hindu fellows to begin again, to start again so each person has the right to dignity. Let's wash out our history. I would like to share the prophetic words of Baldwin. I quote, history is literally present in all we do. History is literally present in all we do. Yes, it is present It is the present needs to be tended to. It is the present that we have control over. It is the present that we will become tomorrow's history, history for our children and grandchildren. Baldwin shared these words which are relevant to begin again. I quote, "We are living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent. It is not white, this world. It is not black either. The future of this world depends on everyone in this room," says Baldwin. And in this room where we are. And that future depends on to what extent means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which cannot bear the weight of reality. Liberation from the language and categories that box us in requires that we tap the source of it all, free ourselves of the lie, and start this whole damn thing over. End quote. When I read these words, it totally touched my deepest part of my soul. Even though Baldwin was outraged by the atrocities and overcome by despair, he saw salvation in love. And I share this quote with you. "There is absolutely no salvation without love. This is the wheel in the middle of the wheel." And we have to think about this metaphor. This is the wheel in the middle of the wheel. Salvation does not divide. Salvation connects. It's not the exclusive property of any dogma, creed, or church. It keeps the channel open between oneself and however one wishes to name that which is greater than oneself. It has nothing to do with one's fortune or one's circumstances in one's passage through the world. It is a mighty fortress, even the teeth of ruin are at the gates of death. Oh, these were powerful words. These words call to the practice and principle of love in the midst of hate. Reverend James Lawson, a civil rights leader, practices and continues to teach love and nonviolent direct action to thousands of Americans. And it's my great privilege to have a friend in him. He and I became quite close, and I just finished an article on him. As a child, James Lawson experienced racial slurs and physical violence from white boys of his age, right? He vividly recalls the day when in 4th grade, while running an errand, a white child yelled the N-word at him. And Lawson responded with a slap. After returning home, he shared the incident with his mother, who with her calmness on her face asked him, "What good did that do?" "What good did that do?" Lawson recalls. She reasserted that Jesus is love and God is love. Finally, she told him there must be a better way. There must be a better way. This encounter was one of the most critical moments in his life. Something he decided years later that John Wesley would have called a sanctification experience, a moment when his life seemed to stand still and change forever. Lawson, as a teacher and a mentor, presents a nonviolent struggle in spiritual terms. When you are a child of God, he says, you try thereby to imitate Jesus in the midst of evil, which means if someone slaps you on the one cheek, you turn the other cheek, which is an act of resistance. It means that you do not only love your neighbor, but you recognize that even the enemy has a spark of God in them. What kind of big heart that takes. So we cannot solve our problems and issues through legislations alone. There is a great need for mobilizing love force. In Soul Force, in his sermon, Love in Action, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. proclaims, we must see the cross as a magnificent symbol of the love conquering hate and the light overcoming darkness. Lawson, King, Congressman John Lewis, and many other leaders of civil rights movement have shown us the power of nonviolent direct action. That brings love in the center, life in the center, and justice in the center. John Lewis considered love to be the grounding foundation of nonviolent civil disobedience, of active pacifism. I end with Toni Morrison's eulogy at Baldwin's funeral, which Glaudes notes. I quote, "Yours was tenderness of vulnerability that asked everything, expected everything, and like the world's own Merlin, provided us with the ways and means to deliver." End quote. The message has been delivered. We have to ask for everything, expect everything, and begin again now at this moment in our own decisions, own actions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first respondent, Reverend Akiko Miyake-Stoner. Reverend Akiko Miyake-Stoner is senior pastor at United Japanese Christian Church, Clovis. She will provide a United Methodist Christian perspective. Reverend Akiko has been serving in the Fresno, Clovis area since 2010. She is committed to community and justice building in our area. She has a Master's of Divinity from Pacific School of Religion, Berkeley, California, and a BA in Religion from Cornell College, Iowa. She's the chair of California Nevada Conference of the United Methodist Church Committee on the Christian Unity and Interreligious Relationships, and a member of Faith in Fresno and the Interfaith Alliance of Central California. Thank you for joining us, Reverend Akiko.
Thank you so much, Zena. I'm so humbled to be included in this series with so many, emotionally and intellectually intelligent people. So I'm so grateful to reflect alongside you, good folks, Dr. Howard, Drs. Duerksen and Zena today. And thank you so much to Melinda and Jim for all your efforts for this year's Interfaith Scholar Weekend. So in Dr. Howard's reflections, it was a delight to hear her speak of the Reverend James Lawson, reflecting on a formative and transformative experience in his life. He called it a sanctification experience, echoing John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. So when we United Methodists talk about sanctification, what we're talking about is when one's love for God and one's love for others is made complete. Basically, when our love for God and others is our priority and our number one commitment. In the 18th century, John Wesley was an Anglican priest seeking to reform the Church of England as he experienced its corruption and hypocrisy and sought to bring to light the ways it was not meeting the needs of the common people. Although he never set out to begin his own denomination, there are several Protestant denominations today with Wesleyan roots. One nickname Wesley has been given over the years is that of practical theologian. So instead of theology for theology's sake, he was more interested in how our ideas about God and the world shape how we act and how we relate in the world. So he was very methodical, hence the name of our church. He seemed to have a process, a methodology for everything, including engaging issues and thoughts, a process which is now called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. This method of theological reflection is made up of 4 aspects: scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. Inspired by Dr. Howard's inclusion of Reverend James Lawson, I'd like to bring John Wesley into this conversation as I reflect for the next few moments on the end of Glaude's book from my religious perspective and how the Wesleyan quadrilateral might apply to Baldwin's journey, Glaude's analysis of it, and where we find ourselves today. So scripture, the Bible, the Christian sacred text, is where it all begins for Wesley. Several times Glaude refers to Baldwin's vision of the New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation chapter 21, where it says, "I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." So these visions of the end times, as received and recorded by John of Patmos, must have grounded James Baldwin in a transcendent hope beyond the suffering and racism around him, beyond the frustrations within him. Baldwin's New Jerusalem could also be called the beloved community, to use Dr. King's phrase, and the kingdom of God come to earth, to use another Christian phrase. Genesis tells us that everyone is made in the image of God. Therefore, everyone is equally valued, precious, and miraculous. This is the truth of the New Jerusalem, of the beloved community, of the kingdom of God. Tradition is the second aspect of the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Tradition is synonymous with history. Baldwin talks about the United States' aversion to history, and Glaude lifts up the complex relationship between history and memory that preoccupied Baldwin as the country embraced Reaganism and forgot the movement of the 60s. The forgetfulness of history is a dangerous thing. Glaude writes, "History and time blur as the traumas of the present call forward a litany of past betrayals. Slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, police killings, prisons, black ghettos, failed schools, and the people and politicians who sanctioned it all." Yes, forgetting history is a dangerous thing. And as a mixed race Japanese American, I recall what happened to our community during World War II. Throughout my life, I have heard many firsthand accounts from people I love about their time in camp, as it's euphemistically called. If we forget the civil liberties denied the Japanese and Japanese Americans, if we don't remember the lessons learned from incarcerating 120,000 people based solely on how they looked, how can we ensure that it will not happen again? And indeed, we sadly see history repeating itself. With the racial profiling of Muslims and Arab Americans post 9/11, with the families separated at the border, with the kids in cages right now at the Carrizo Springs Detention Center and people in ICE detention facilities. This is what happens when we fail to be students of history. Dr. Howard reminded us of this. When Glaude visited the Legacy Museum, he recalled Baldwin's words, "History is literally present in all we do." Sometimes it said, "Whose history?" Often it's from the viewpoint of the victor or the people in power. From whatever angle history is told, everyone is affected, and Glaude reflects on that as he observed the other visitors at the museum. He writes, "I got the sense that what was happening as people confronted the violence was an attempt to give voice to the trauma at the heart of the American experience, not just an attempt to depict the scars and bruises endured by Black people, but to show what that violence had done to the souls of white Americans." This trigger from history demands much of us, more than just condemning Reaganism or Trumpism, but as Glaude says, it necessitates an honest confrontation with and condemnation of one's complicity with a way of life that insists that some people matter more than others, and with a society to reflect that belief. We must confront what the history of white supremacy has done to all of us, how it has informed policy and practice, and how we work together to move forward to create the New Jerusalem. The House, as you know, is discussing HR 40, which establishes a commission to, quote, "examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies." Among other requirements, the commission shall identify, 1, the role of the federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery, 2, forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and 3, lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and society, end quote. This commission is a step in the right direction. It takes historical memory and trauma into account. And I also wonder how the Japanese American reparations movement in the 1980s might inform this work. So let's move on now to reason, the third aspect in Wesley's quadrilateral. Reason refers to rational thinking and scientific understanding. In 1969, Baldwin reflected on the establishment of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which provided weapons, surveillance, and research about criminality to local police departments, much of which targeted Black communities to prevent crimes and riots, resulting in increased militarization of police departments. This was a direct result of the lie that America has told itself for centuries, and that it continues to tell itself, that Black lives don't matter as much as white ones. In order to combat this lie, places like the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the Lynching Memorial, these places need to exist to expose the life or death consequences of believing that Black lives are disposable and their idleness pose a threat to the Republic. This is what the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration signaled. Baldwin saw that Black lives were no longer sources of wealth to be exploited, but now were disposable to society built on this lie. In a 1960 speech, Baldwin reflected on early America, a melting pot with racial hierarchies that enable a certain definition of white America over and against Black people. For as Baldwin says, the Negro tells us where the bottom is because he is there. And where he is beneath us, we know where the limits are and how far we must not fall. Glaude writes, even so, we, Black and white, Baldwin believed, remained inextricably linked, bound together forever with love, and together we would bring forth a new majority. So we come now to experience the final piece of the Wesleyan quadrilateral. What can we learn from our painful experiences? How do we choose to use our experience to inform how we live and are in the world? The truth is, oh, sorry. Pardon me. The truth is, many lives were smashed on the Freedom Road. The trauma is real, and Glaude invites us to tell its story. I was moved by his description of the jars of soil at the Legacy Museum, shelves of different colored dirt from the places where people were lynched. He says they revealed the geography of violence. Some were labeled with names and counties, some just counties when the person remained unknown. Witnessing a wall like this moves us beyond any intellectual thought process, but evokes something deeply in our heart and gut. As Dr. Howard so beautifully put it, there is great need for mobilizing love force and soul force. In the same vein, Baldwin declares that salvation is accepting and reciprocating the love of God. Salvation is not separation. It is the beginning of union with all that is or has been or ever will be, end quote. Indeed, our salvation is connected to one another. It is in the shared experiences of vulnerable moments in community, in accepting the beautiness and ugliness of who we are, that we are all miracles and disasters, as Glaude says. The white supremacy that's having a resurgence today in mainstream America isn't unprecedented, Glaude says. We have to understand our own anger and disappointments and figure out for ourselves how to pick up the pieces, to hold off the temptations of hate and despair, and to fight the battle once again. Americans must walk through the ruins toward the terror and fear and lay bare the trauma that we all carry with us. Baldwin tells us that he built the tone of his book on this statement from Baldwin, which I'll end with. Baldwin says, you must understand that your pain is trivial, except insofar as you can use it to connect with other people's pain, and insofar as you can do that with your pain, you can be released from it. And then hopefully it works the other way around too. Insofar as I can tell you what it is to suffer, perhaps I can help you suffer less. So yes, friends, let's mobilize our experiences of suffering, of injustice, of anger to bring about less suffering in the world, even if it's just for one person. I suspect this is how Baldwin harnessed his hope to create for us, in Glaude's words, a roadmap to travel toward a better country, a better world. Thank you so much for letting me share this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Reverend Akiko. At this time, I'd like to introduce our second respondent, Dr. Duerksen. Dr. Darren Duerksen is an associate professor of intercultural and religious studies at Fresno Pacific University, who provides an evangelical Anabaptist Christian perspective. He is a member of both Faith in the Valley Clergy Caucus and the Interfaith Scholar Weekend Planning Committee. Prior to university teaching, Professor Duerksen worked in a Christian international development and ministry for 18 years. 6 of those he worked in India. He has become active in local social justice initiatives, including those that work across faith communities. He earned his PhD in intercultural studies at Fuller Theological Seminary and his Master's of Divinity at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary. Thank you so much, Dr. Duerksen, for joining us today.
Thank you, Zena. And I want to join my thanks to everybody, to those that my colleagues have already thanked, Melinda Patari, Jim Grant, Zena, for your gracious hosting and work in helping to organize this. And thanks, Dr. Howard, for your response, and also Reverend Miyake-Stoner for your thoughts here. Already, this is incredibly rich, what we are experiencing here. I'm going to dive right into my reflections, and doing so as someone who, as was introduced, is part of the particular church called the Mennonite Brethren Church, which is both part of the Anabaptist tradition and is influenced by and draws on aspects of the more recent evangelical tradition. So I have greatly appreciated journeying with Glaude these last weeks, and his reflections and challenges on how we may begin again in this time of moral and racial reckoning. Dr. Howard, in her remarks, highlights the ways in which Baldwin and Glaude recognize that we are in the midst of ruins, these ruins of our aftertimes, but that there are also pathways forward for how to liberate us from the lies that we have told ourselves again and again, and to begin again. A key point that she highlights, evident from Baldwin, and that resonated with Gandhi and with civil rights leaders like Reverend James Lawson, is the power and importance of nonviolent love. These are methods and motivations that Baldwin grapples with, and that people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Reverend Lawson embrace. And as I reflect on methods and motivations like these, nonviolent love, the way in which, and also on the way in which our conversations sometimes proceed among those of us who seek to challenge white supremacy and promote anti-racism, I'm also struck by the way we often shy away from particularities, especially the particularities of method, nonviolence versus other methods, and the particularities of motivation or source of our efforts and our work. Where does our energy come from? Where does this love come from that we so strongly promote? So I want to briefly address each of these particularities. And after each, I'm going to pose a question for Dr. Howard to respond to, as she will, or as we have time for. First, on the particularity of method. Now, as an Anabaptist, I am a part of what some call the Peace Church tradition. Now, for us, historically, nonviolence is very important. And it is a methodology, but it is more than that. It is a lifestyle. It is a theology. It's a way of life. It permeates, or at least it can and it should permeate, into all areas of our perspective and our lives and our actions. It's not just simply a means to an end, though we do believe it provides an important, a crucial means towards a just end, but it is more. It's the basis of the way in which we relate to God and his creation. and the way in which God calls all of creation to relate to each other. Now, some have called it pacifism, but many of us reject that term now, or at least resist it, because to be nonviolent in a very violent-oriented society requires a great deal of effort. It's anything but a passive exercise. Now, as I read Baldwin and Glaude, and I'll admit, I am by no means an expert on or in their work, but I see them grappling with it. I see them seeking to walk a tightrope between the nonviolence of Martin Luther King and the forceful and perhaps even at times violent approaches of those like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. In the Indian context, which we're also alluding to here in our conversation today, it would be between Mahatma Gandhi and Subhas Chandra Bose. Now in India, and in their now dominant telling of their own history, it is Gandhi's nonviolence that triumphs. And he's honored and revered, and his image shows up on all their currency, and he's called the father of their nation. But Dalit or untouchable or low caste activists in recent decades point to the persistence of caste injustice, and they deeply dispute just how far Gandhi's nonviolent triumph has actually worked or extended. And it's not unlike the ways in which Baldwin and Glaude seem to question King and ponder how effective this active pacifism that John Lewis later is speaking about would, how that would truly bring about a new Jerusalem or a new society. What will raise us out of the ruins of our aftertime? And I hear this questioning. I hear the rage of Baldwin and Glaude. And I hear, and perhaps to an extent, I can feel the passion of many of my friends and my colleagues, including some who have spoken in this series. They question the extent of nonviolence. Maybe not openly, but it's a question mark that's out there. But I'm not persuaded against the way of nonviolence. Now, in saying this, I recognize that as a white Christian male, I speak from the position of privilege. In one sense, I have the luxury and the safety and the security from which to speak of nonviolence. I recognize this. I'm sure only I recognize it dimly, and I proceed with humility here, but I still proceed with some conviction. I want to probe more deeply, as many in my tradition have, about the ways in which we can pursue a non-violent pattern of life and activism without using this as an excuse to allow change at a snail's pace, or to excuse and allow dominant narratives and structures to persist. The way of an active nonviolence may, and those who would critique it, actually keep us from beginning again and continuing the work. So, one question I would have for Dr. Howard as a scholar of Gandhi is, how do we guard against, how would Gandhi perhaps extend his logic into our area and guard against, not allow the nonviolence that he espoused and the King espoused to simply reinforce dominant narratives and structures? How do we defend and champion the particular way of nonviolence in light of very real criticisms and the urgency of the moment? This leads me to the second particularity that we often shy away from, and I'll keep this one brief. I fully agree with and appreciate Baldwin's and Glaude's ending reflections on the importance of love. Dr. Howard rightly highlights how this has guided other important figures, such as the civil rights leader, Reverend Lawson. The lines that Dr. Howard quotes about love from one of Baldwin's last essays, they could, as an evangelical pastor may say, absolutely preach. They're beautiful lines. But I fear that the language of love and the rhetoric and the narrative of love can get also lost in and lack particularity. And I fear that we don't go much further. And I understand this because to probe more deeply will reveal difference. But such questions don't have to divide us. Rather, if treated well, they can enrich us. A couple of examples from the evangelical part of me who wants to speak out on this behalf. In a letter by the Apostle John in the New Testament scriptures, 1 John 4, he has a wonderful and complex teaching on love. He says statements that could preach in any number of traditions, those traditions that preach. He says things like, there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or a sister is a liar. But these are juxtaposed with particularity. In the midst of these statements, for example, he says, we love because he, that is God, that is a particular way of understanding the nature and the deity of God, he first loved us. Another example, Baldwin draws on the imagery of the New Jerusalem. Beautiful language. And as an artist and author, he can take liberties with it and do some wonderful things with it. But if we go back to its origins, in the passage just after where Reverend Miyake-Stoner reads, we're told that this New Jerusalem, this image of a new society, and its center is the Lamb, which for John is Jesus, who acts as the focal point. He's the one that disseminates light. He's the one that is the center and focal point of this new society. So now I bring all this up to say that these highlight a particularity, importance of Jesus in this regard. And I know that not everyone would agree with this, of course. And I don't think this should create divisions of our friendships and our coalitions. But my point is that many evangelical Christians and those of us influenced by evangelicalism, the source and primary object of love is hugely important. For us to ignore the energizing work of God in Christ through the Spirit would be like not putting gas into your car, but still expecting it to run. You may indeed be able to move it in other ways, but you're going to be missing out on something extremely crucial to its design. And so, but I can't also help but realize that there's profound expressions of love, deep, powerful, profound expressions of love in so many other traditions. And so my quick question as I wrap up for Dr. Howard, and I understand if we don't have time or scope to really get to it, is what would Gandhi have said fuels the love that he demonstrated so wonderfully and forcefully, that allowed him to begin and continue his own work? What would he suggest from the perspective of his own Hindu tradition is the source, the focus, the ultimate purpose of the love that he demonstrates? Thank you again, Dr. Howard, and all for these wonderful opportunities. I look forward to our ongoing discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duerksen. Dr. Howard, just time check. We do have maybe 9 minutes, so I will, allow you this time to address this question, and then we can wrap up if time allows.
Zena, may I clarify, do we want to take some questions also from the audience, or are you monitoring, or what do you think? I can answer that in 2-3 minutes, and then I let you decide.
Sure. I don't see any questions from the audience on my end here. So I can let you, reply to this question, and then I can present the question that I have posed.
Alrighty. So I would like to thank you both, Reverend Miyake-Stoner and Dr. Duerksen. I think these are very pertinent questions, and appreciated your comments and engaging with not only with the book, but with my comments and taking them seriously. Because when there was so much to think about it, that we could have a whole hour each and have a really rich conversation. So I think the question of your idea of the means and ends is very, very important for Gandhi, and for, I think, we're looking at our situation. If my goal is, according to Gandhi, is peace, love, unity, interconnectedness, care, how could the means be violent? And then, because violence will incur more violence or hate or some kind of a community which is not what our Reverend mentioned, is not a beloved community. It's not a New Jerusalem. It is something else. And I think that is the point that Reverend Lawson makes. Then he says the I asked him, I said, some people don't believe in Jesus, or they don't believe in God the way you do, or non, atheist or non-believers. He said, and Gandhi would say that, I'm going to come to Gandhi, it's a life force. It's the life force we all understand. He gave me this example in his last workshop, week and a half ago on Saturday, that when a baby is born and the baby is so helpless, baby cannot survive by itself. But what happens that we parents do anything and everything to keep this baby alive. And that life force that we need to recognize in all. And Gandhi was also posed that question when he met with some atheists, and they were more moral, more kinder, more loving than those who claim to be religious. So interesting formula. He used to say, God is truth. T, capital. Truth means reality, life, being, which is the basic condition of all of us. Life, love are interconnected for him. Nonviolence and justice are interconnected for him. Nonviolence and love are interconnected for him. Nonviolence and compassion are interconnected. They're two sides of one coin. So if you say nonviolence, and I have had discussions with Dalits as well and many other critiques of Gandhi, right? What is the option? What are the options were available, right? What did Bose did? How did that what kind of India would have looked like then? Of course, I appreciate what he did. Of course, we all appreciate whoever dedicated so much for the freedom of the country. Your idea of the source of power that comes to you, or who those as a Jesus, believer in Jesus, that idea that comes to you. For Gandhi, that idea, he will never not recognize that there was some eternal source. You can call it different names, power, energy, source, different religions have different names, but that force is within us. And that force inspires us. And so when he said God, used to say God is truth, then he reversed it, truth is God. He said, if you believe in life, if you believe in love, if you believe in care, then you're believing in God, whatever name that might be, whatever that thing might be. So you're right, that has to be, and the word hope, I think when you were asking, I think Zena was asking that question, the hope, we cannot afford not being hopeful. We cannot afford it. It's not possible that we can afford despair, because despair is the precondition of hope. It's not, as soon as we lose hope, we are done with it. I have to trust my fellow beings, they will change. I have to trust, even according to John Lewis and Lawson, Dr. King, and these people have a lot of conversation, a lot of critics, a lot of people who are challenging their ideas. They've been assassinated, they've been hurt, they've been called out, but they always held to centralizing love. They didn't go from there. They did not question love. Of course, there's some time they talked about, well, violence can have some kind of role in fighting justice. Gandhi said toward the end of his life, there was some situations as the World War II that one has to use. But he wants to stop us beforehand. He wants us to create the condition where we don't have violence. There is a question in the chat, if any one of you guys want to take it. How do we maybe Zena can read it, please. That would be better.
Thank you.
I'm a teacher, I just go right into it.
No worries. We have 3 minutes here, so I'm going to propose this quick question from the chat. How do we unify different groups that don't see nonviolence as part of their core values in social movement and social building? And how do we build a coalition around nonviolence today?
I'll let my colleagues answer it.
Reverend Miyake-Stoner, I hope that you will also jump in with something here. It's a really important question. And again, from my own perspective, and I share a lot of the same sort of sense that Dr. Howard, what you're sharing about just how fundamental nonviolence can and should be. It's hard for me to envision being a part of something that isn't nonviolent. Now, the degree to which force and forceful action can be used, we can debate that. And maybe there's some there's some leeway. Maybe there's even a little bit of disagreement. And I will move quite a ways in my own allowance of forceful action. I may not necessarily go there myself personally, and yet I will allow that certain things probably need to happen, kind of as Gandhi did as he was reflecting on World War II. And at some point, and I'll just confess I haven't defined it really carefully in my mind, although I know the extremes. At some point, there's a point where I would say I can't be in coalition with this particular. We may believe a lot of the same kinds of, we may identify a lot of the same injustices, but our vision of how this future should look is just very different.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duerksen. I'm so sorry, Reverend Miyake-Stoner. We are just running out of time here. So I'd just like to wrap up and thank you so much, Professor Howard, Reverend Akiko, and Professor Duerksen for this insightful discussion and for sharing personal experiences and stories that need to be told and heard. Lastly, thank you to our participants for joining today's live conversation and sharing your thoughts in the comments. With that, we'll have Jim close today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Zena, for moderating our little discussion, for our professors and our reverend who shared with us from the depths of their own tradition around the material that Baldwin and Glaude gave us. Thank you for what you bring not only today, but in your lives as professors and as leaders and as pastors of churches and congregations, for what you do out in the world to bring nonviolence, to bring the message of our need to begin again, to bring it out into the public. Thank you beyond words, everyone involved in this program today. Secondly, I need to invite you to next week, where some of the unfinished business, some of the very questions that were on the table and there was no time to really develop to respond, we will be having our final session. 3 scholars will come back who were here with us a month ago. 4 of our local faith leaders will come together, and the 7 of them and Professor Dr. Andrew Fiala from Fresno State's Ethics Center will share around guiding lights for a shared anti-racist future, which is exactly where we were getting to that point today. What do we do now? How do we follow up on Baldwin's passion and Glaude's presentation? How do we build on Dr. Howard's presentation? Third point, go to interfaithscholar.org if you haven't already. All of our videos of the other programs, they're all there. All of the discussions are all there. All of our moderators and the speakers, their bios are there. You'll learn more about all of us. If you enjoyed this, have your own independent Zoom study. Take the book, Begin Again, or take the videos and work with them as a small group. We hope you will do that. Next to last, evaluations. We would love you to be able to fill out a form that you'll find in the very material we're going to send you tomorrow. Along with the clip, we'll send you the evaluation so you could weigh in and give us direction for next week's discussion. next to last. These have been free, these 5 that we've done and the next one. But if you would like to help us, please go to interfaithscholar.org. There's a little button to press on and click to help us by donating. Help support Interfaith Scholar Weekend. On that note, I want to thank everyone again, invite you back next week at the same time. It'll be a different link, which you will be receiving in your email box, so look for it. Join us next week. Be safe, take care, and remember, it's the Ides of March, so be careful. Take care. God bless.